Welcome back. This lecture is on medieval mysticism and an example of a few of the medieval mystics. Now, why do we do this in a course in historical theology? Well, for a couple of reasons. One is that the medieval mystics did have an influence on theology. They were influenced by the theologians, that some of which we've already seen, and we'll note that. And they did have an impact going forward on the theology, not only of the Middle Ages themselves, but even going on further into the Reformation era. And so that's one reason. They do influence the theologians. And for another reason is because they're very interesting. And frankly, a lot of courses really don't spend any time at all. And since we're just doing brief little videos and an insight into some of these theologians anyway, I felt it would be a good idea to at least have one of these short lectures dealing with this particular phase of medieval theology and expose you to some of this interesting stuff. So let me proceed then to the Middle Ages, medieval mysticism, and mystics. First of all, let's answer the question, what is mysticism? The definition of mysticism and the description of the instances of mystical encounter are difficult. That's by the nature of this particular phenomenon, mysticism. It's clear, however, that mysticism is not the same thing as magic, clairvoyance, parapsychology, occultism, nor does it consist in preoccupation with sensory images, visions, special revelations, or all of those sorts of things. Although some of the idea of people having visions or special revelations might be a part of it, that's not even the main part of what we're really trying to talk about here. And particularly, we're not talking about something occult or something that is even demonic or touching spirits, or I'm not talking about ghosts or all of that kind of stuff. Talking about something a little bit, although it is not necessarily normal, sort of a spirituality. It's not really sort of bad, or some of the kind of things we might think about when we think about mysticism, or in a popular way. Back to the slide. Nearly all Christian mystics relegate these phenomena to the periphery and avoid the occult arts entirely. So it's not about that stuff. Briefly and generally stated, mystical theology, or Christian mysticism, seeks to describe an experiential, direct, non-abstract, unmediated, loving knowledge of God, a knowing and seeing so direct as to be called even union with God. And there is a long history to that that we could get into, but I'm trying to be brief here. Mysticism is an approach to Christianity that focuses on preparation for and consciousness of and reaction to what can be described as the immediate or direct presence of God. Emphasis is placed on the subjective or felt experience of being in an intimate relationship with God, what some mystics refer to as spiritual ecstasy. The earthly goal of this relationship is personal, ethical, and spiritual transformation, the heavenly culmination of which is the beatific vision. The beatific vision is just a shorthand phrase for the vision of God, or the direct and immediate perception of God, seeking the face of God, we might say. In Christian theology, the beatific vision, or in Latin, the visio beatifica, is the ultimate direct self-communication of God to the individual person. You see there, Dante Alighieri's great work, The Divine Comedy, is actually an epic poem in 3 parts. The Inferno, which refers to Hades, Purgatorio, you can see that that's purgatory, and Paradiso, that would be heaven, in which Alighieri imagines a trip of the soul or person from Hades to heaven through these three dimensions. And the whole point is to arrive at the beatific vision, to get to heaven in order to see God. A very entertaining work if you have the chance to read it. It will take you longer than an afternoon. I'm being facetious there. It's a very long and involved poem, but it's one of the greats of literature. But again, you have to understand the importance for someone like Dante Alighieri on achieving the beatific vision in order to realize the many of the parts of that particular epic imaginary trip. Well, beyond that, some sub-themes of mysticism: the experiences of union with God, deeper contemplation of God, deeper personal intimacy with God, certain visionary experiences, whether that's angels or saints. All of that was a part of mysticism. The means to such experience: how did the mystics gain such experiences? Well, it would be meditation, deep meditation, not just reading the word, but deeply meditating on it, praying through it again and again. Solitude, devotional acts, again, like prayer, contemplation, silence, fasting, abstaining from all temporal pleasures, even basic needs of food. In particular, practicing chastity had a very deep, meaningful part in terms of the mystics. And as you can see, if I might just pause here, many of those practices are things that we would say, well, yes, those are things we might want to engage in. And if we were teaching a class on spiritual formation, for instance, we would want to talk about Bible study or times of prayer and contemplation, fasting, and these things. But the medieval mystics took this to another level beyond that, beyond what we might just refer to as spiritual formation. So back to the slide here, the descriptions of the experience: deeply personal contact with God, at times described in frankly amorous terms, sometimes embarrassingly so, like one lover speaking to another, things like that. We would probably not be comfortable with talking about our relationship with God in those kinds of terms, but they didn't mean it in a sort of sensual way or an inappropriate way. They were trying to express the depth of feeling that they would have in terms of their deep personal contact or relationship with God. So they use terms like ecstasy, rapture, elation, bliss, pleasure. Again, we might feel somewhat uncomfortable with those terms, but if you eliminate all of the sort of inappropriate aspects of those things, you might get a closer approximation of what the mystics were trying to say. Their mysticism is something that is non-cognitive and ineffable. What do we mean by that? It means that you don't get there simply by gaining more intellectual knowledge, studied doctrines piled up on one another, or becoming an expert in systematic theology. Those are wonderful things. Those are the things I've pursued most of my life and my teaching career. But they're talking about ineffable experiences. What that means, an experience in which you have this deeply personal and direct sense of the direct contact with God, deeply personal, but not irrational. We're not talking about something that is bizarre or things of that nature. So the mystic's experience of God's presence is so intense and personal that it can't be described in merely cognitive terms. That's the point, in terms of knowing or understanding. So you couldn't write it down like you could a description of a trip to the store or a summary of a lecture of a class or something like that. That's what it means to be ineffable. The true experience of God's presence and love is not something attainable by utilizing human reason, according to the mystics here, such as observation, deduction, induction, inference, implication, any form of intellectual activity that's based upon proof or reasons or arguments. That's not how you get to the experience that the mystic wants. Rather, it's by a direct infusion from God himself that engages the spiritual rather than the mental center of the individual. Where did this sort of thinking and practice come from? What came to be identified as Christian mysticism did not come from ancient mystery religions or pagan practices of ecstatic or frenzied acts of so-called worship. A distinct mystical or mystery theology emerged from the Alexandrian school of exegesis, going all the way back to Clement of Alexandria and Origen. We talked about those fellows in a much earlier lecture. Their search for the hidden meaning of Scripture and their exposition of the mystery of redemption. Even the Cappadocian Fathers, and we heard about them in an earlier lecture, especially Gregory of Nyssa, leading monastics, especially Evagrius of Pontus and John Cassian. We haven't talked about those fellows before, but you might want to do a search on them and read more about them. Augustine of Hippo, we've seen him before. And think about Augustine's conversion in Milan and the intensity of his feeling there. And you get kind of an idea of where the mystics were seeking to reproduce that for themselves, to get that kind of an experience. And even the obscure personage of Dionysius, Pseudo-Areopagite, or Pseudo-Dionysius, as we called him. And we talked about him before. Back when we talked about Dionysius, Pseudo-Dionysius, we said a lot of his writings really had a greater impact on the mystics than they did often the theologians. And so we're making that point again. So the mystics weren't people who came up with bizarre notions on their own. They were people that were serious-minded, even though they might be more led by their experience than they were by reason. Sam Storms, in this quote from his discussion of this on his website, says it can't be conceived. Mysticism can't be conceived as a movement for the simple fact that, by definition, as we've seen, it's inconsistent with organizational structures or characteristics of movements. That is to say, mysticism lacks definite theological boundaries. So you can't really say it's a movement. As we're going to see, the mystics really didn't even, relate to one another, and they didn't build on one another's works, so to speak. They all were influenced by one another, but they all sought their own individual, personal experience with God. So mysticism is much too fluid and diverse to be to qualify as an identifiable movement. Mysticism is much more unique religious emphasis or element within Christian experience as a whole. So now thinking about medieval mysticism in particular, in contrast to the great intellectual works of the scholastics, the medieval period, which is the 12th through the 14th centuries, witnessed some of the most profound and moving religious experiences of all time. All the great theologians of the Middle Ages, including Anselm Aquinas and Bernardo Clairvaux, were also writers of a great spiritual depth and dimension. Yet even they were overshadowed by the extraordinary flowering of devotion and mysticism which was to bloom in the monasteries and parish churches throughout that period. So at the same time, these great intellectual giants and theologians were also spiritual. And we're not saying that those guys were just intellectuals, like, again, Aquinas and others. But that the mystics, again, took it to a different level. And they did so, again, independently of these scholars, and as I've just said a moment ago, somewhat independently of one another. So these are very individualistic sort of seekers of this beatific vision, as we called it. Well, actually, I'm going to stop there and go back, because I'm going to come back to keep this particular segment shorter. We're going to come back and start talking about some individual medieval mystics during this particular time, and then finish out this set of PowerPoints with a separate recording. So we'll stop for now.